good to see all of you. And in a moment, we will get back into this study that we've been engaged in for some time. I'm going to relate to this throughout tonight. And so if you need one, feel free to go out and get a sip of water if you get a little bit of voice issues or throat tickling on you. But I'm going to sip on this as we go through tonight. Arnold asked me when I came in the building, he said, how you feeling? And I said, I'm fine. I just can't talk very long without having to cough. I feel fine otherwise. And he said, you need somebody to preach for you tonight. And I should have took him up on that if he meant him. That would have been, but it's kind of funny. I got to thinking about that question, and I say this really in relationship to how God has blessed me over the years. Today, I complete 23 years of full-time preaching. I didn't really think about that, actually, until he said that. 23 years. I started the first Sunday of October in 1991 over in Cameron, Ohio. And so this being the last Sunday of September, this completes 23 years of full-time preaching. And in that 23 years, I have never missed a Sunday that I was supposed to preach. Not one sermon have I missed that I was supposed to preach in 23 years of full-time preaching. I've never missed, and I don't necessarily say that because of trying to do that on purpose necessarily, but it was just interesting to me that when he said that, I thought, well, why would I start now after 23 years? Now my wife's trying to remind me of something. I said, and I should clarify that by my own sickness, I have never missed a Sunday in 23 years. I did miss the Sunday morning that Samuel was born. That is the only time that I actually called and said, and I'll go back even a little further since we're reminiscing anyway. I'll go back a little further with you for a moment. And Doris, I don't know whether you can attest to this anymore. You may have fixed it after you moved in the house down there. But I almost missed a Sunday night out of Malott Ridge years ago. When Deborah and I were first married, we lived down in the house that Doris now lives in. And on a Sunday afternoon, her brother and sister-in-law and their firstborn had come to visit us, and I took one step down into the basement and flew the rest of the way to the bottom of those steps. And there's a board at the end. I believe one of those steps is busted down towards the end. You may have repaired it. But if you got there, it's busted, and this elbow right there is what busted it when I landed on the bottom. And I wondered, how am I going to go preach when I can't even move off this couch? And a snowstorm come up, and they called and canceled services. And so from that day forward, I've been perfectly able to. So anyway, it's been a great life that the Lord's blessed me with. And it's been a wonderful opportunity over 23 years to be involved in a lot of different congregations, 4 of them in full-time capacities, and lots of them in relationship to opportunities to preach. The Lord has blessed me with good health, obviously, and that I am thankful for. He has cared for me in health regards, very, very minor issues over the years that I've had to deal with health-wise. And I think sometimes we're real quick to plead and beg and maybe even sometimes blame God for poor health. But maybe sometimes we need to stop and say, thank you, Lord, for the good health that I've been experiencing and that you have had maybe at times. And maybe we're not always perfectly healthy, but there are times where we do feel pretty good and God's blessing us, and we need to honor Him and thank Him for that. This lesson tonight is probably, well, it is, there's no question about probably, it is the shortest in the series, and that's coincidental to the way I feel tonight in terms of my voice, but that's just where it fell as we get in here to Philadelphia. I really did not want to combine it with the last portion of the study because there's a lot to be said when we get to the final church in the discussion here, and so we don't want to rob that opportunity. And so let's just talk about the church at Philadelphia tonight, and we'll leave the Laodiceans to the end of our study, Lord willing, next Sunday evening, and I have probably ruined that for myself anyway, so we'll see what happens by next Sunday. But here, this church at Philadelphia, and remember last time we showed you a slide and we said how sad this slide is, because we've been using this approach was what's right, what's wrong, what's the admonition, what's the warning Jesus gave, and then is there any kind of promise or reward that He offers them. And we looked last week at Sardis and how sad it, well not last week, 2 weeks ago, how sad it was to throw up that first slide and say what is right with the church there, and we had to leave it blank because there was nothing that Jesus said that was good at that place. Jesus did not commend the congregation there for anything. How He spoke about a remnant, He spoke about a few folks that were there individualistically who were striving to honor Him, but as a congregation, that entire church, the slate was blank. Jesus didn't say anything was right about them. This congregation is the exact opposite. Our first slide, in a little bit of reverse order, that's what we've been doing, is this one. I'll get there. This is the reminder of what we've seen in the past and what we're dealing with here in the areas that we're dealing with. This is Philadelphia that we're talking about. I should pause for a moment since this is on the charts and mention to you that if I'm understanding the historical folks that I'm reading from, there are remnants potentially of these other churches, these 6 others, other than Philadelphia. There are remnants of those places in and around different cities in Turkey. Remember, Asia Minor here that we're dealing with in those days is present-day Turkey. And there are relics, remnants, on the outskirts of various places in Turkey that are the remnants of these. But to my knowledge, if I'm reading correctly, Philadelphia is the only one of the 7 where there is an existing city still sitting where Philadelphia sat. There were remnants and pieces of these other places on the outskirts of different present-day cities. But over the generations, they have continued to keep a viable city on the same location where ancient Philadelphia sat. Now, there is still no church there, as we've studied throughout the series. None of these churches still exist in relationship to the 7 churches of Asia. But there is a city that still resides there where the same site of Philadelphia was in those days. Now, here's the reading that Gary just had, and here's the interesting slide then. What's wrong here at Philadelphia? Nothing. What a great testimony to this church, that Jesus gives them nothing in the listing that's wrong there congregationally. Our slide is blank because Jesus doesn't say anything. Normally, as we've seen up until we saw Sardis 2 weeks ago, where we said what was right and the slide was blank, tonight we have the opposite of that, as the church at Philadelphia has nothing wrong that Jesus condemns them for congregationally. And that's a tremendous compliment when you think about it. That here's a church that existed. Even in a short span of time, we might say the few decades that they may have been in existence still, to think that there was no particular wrong that was happening there that Jesus wanted to illustrate or point out to them in this revelation. And to me, that's a tremendous testimony to the church there at Philadelphia. That Jesus only wanted to spend His time with them in things that were right. And so go into the text with me in Revelation chapter 3, and let's begin in verse 8. Well, we notice in verse 7 that he identifies who he's writing to, the church in Philadelphia. Write these things, says He who is holy, He who is true, He who has the key of David, He who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. Again, identifying Himself, Jesus does, in various ways to these different churches. And on this particular occasion, he says to them that He is the one who is holy. His testimony and words are trustworthy, and that they can recognize that He is a reliable source of information. And He even identifies His authoritative message by saying He is the one who, when He shuts something, no one can open it. And if He opens it and desires for it to remain open, no one can shut. You have trusted in the power and authority of the Savior, is what He tells to the church at Philadelphia. You have put your faith and confidences in the one who no one is His equal. No one is greater than Him. No one can supersede Him. And when He challenges them to continue to overcome and to persevere, certainly their mind can go back to the fact that He identifies Himself in such a way there at the opening of His statements. In verse 8, he says what is a common phrase that we have seen. He says, I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have a little strength, you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Indeed, I will make thee of the synagogue of Satan, make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. It's an interesting kind of testimony that Jesus gives to them here in this particular moment. I want you to recognize first and foremost that He says, I appreciate the fact that you have used the opportunities that I have presented to you. When I have opened doors to you, you have accessed them and have benefited from them and have used those opportunities for good. The truth of the matter is, friends, that you and I often have doors of opportunity open to us and we shut them as quickly as we can. The Lord provides for us great opportunities sometimes. He has opened them and availed us of those things, and no one can necessarily shut what Jesus opens. We simply refuse to walk through the door. We simply refuse to use the access that He's presented to us and avail ourselves of those opportunities. Notice with me something that is said by the Apostle Paul over in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and in verse 19. When speaking of these churches, he said the churches of Asia, interesting, we haven't done that yet in our study, but there are references in other letters to the churches that we're talking about here in Revelation 2 and 3. And there had been comments, greetings, thoughts been extended from these churches of Asia sent forth unto other areas as well. The churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord, with the church that is in their house. I simply illustrate to you that there were good things going on among the churches of Asia. Opportunities that were being availed. There were individuals who were actively even opening the home that they resided in to continue the progress of the gospel. The churches of Asia were known at the time that Paul writes to those in Corinth as a group of churches that were actively involved serving the Lord. By the time John writes in that later date that I've concluded and talked to you about in relationship to the book of Revelation, by the time Jesus sends this direct revelation through John, things appear to have changed. And in Asia you have some very struggling and very challenged churches, but Philadelphia seems to be staying steadfast and using the opportunities that God presents unto them. And sometimes, friends, when we talk about work, remember we talked this morning about being active. We talked about making ourselves useful. And sometimes in our minds, we think that we have to not only pursue opportunity, but somehow we have to create the opportunities themselves. And sometimes maybe we need to take a step back from that and think about it more in the sense that all we need to do is be ready to avail ourselves of the opportunities that God presents to us. Sometimes we think that every role and every function of the work that we have to do resides in our abilities and in our talents and in our effort, and that's not the case. Any opportunity that we have is an opportunity God gave to us. Any opportunity that we're blessed with, any occasion that we have to share the message of Jesus Christ is an opportunity that God has created. And so let's be active and let's be faithful, but let's recognize that God's the one opening the doors. God is the one who's giving us access. The churches of Asia were active. We need to be active just like the church at Philadelphia, using the opportunities that God grants unto us. And he said that they used their strength to do good. He said, you don't have a lot of it. You ever feel that way? Kind of that way right now. You don't necessarily always have a lot of strength and energy that you might desire to have. You don't always have the fullness and the capacities that you would enjoy having. But he said you were still busy, even with little strength. Go back and note that in the text, back in Revelation chapter 3. Note what he said there when he says, I know your works. No one can shut a door if I open it. And then he says, for you have a little strength, yet have kept my word and have not denied me before others. Even though their strength was not good, even though they were weakened and troubled and challenged quite possibly, especially, he said in verse 9, by those who consider themselves Jews but lie, they're really not. He spoke of the synagogue of Satan again. We've seen that kind of expression already in our study. Now he said, you may be challenged and you may have difficulties, but I appreciate the fact that even when you're troubled, you've stayed steadfast. We need to be a forward-thinking church. But in the midst of challenge, sometimes what a church needs to do is be sure to not go backward in the process. They may have been weakened. They may have been troubled. And Jesus says, I appreciate your steadfastness in the Word, even in the midst of that. That though you may have felt like abandoning, though it may have been an easier course for you to go backwards or flee away from any connection or identification with Jesus, you remain steadfast and faithful to the testimony of His Word. In John chapter 14 and verse 23, John chapter 14 and verse 23, Jesus speaking answers when He was asked how would He manifest Himself to them and not to the world. Jesus answered, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. How are you going to be able to hide yourself from the world, Jesus? If you go out and walk around and talk, will they not be able to see you? And Jesus says, I'm not talking about hiding myself physically. I'm not talking about somehow hiding who I am or they not being able to identify me. I'm talking about the fact that I'll be hidden because they choose to ignore me. They choose to ignore the message that I give, but those who receive the message, those who respond to the Word, they know me, and I and the Father come and we make a connection with them, He says. Our obligation is to stay steadfast to the Word. Our obligation is to remain faithful and confident in the testimony of Jesus Christ. He honors them. Though they may be weak, they kept serving Him. Though they may not have had the strength that they desired, they continued to honor His Word. They obeyed the truth. And they refused to deny. And He says, you'll be vindicated for it. Sometimes it's easier for us to try to distance ourselves from Jesus. In social circles, sometimes it's easier to maybe act like we're not a Christian, or even verbalize, I may go to church, but I'm not really as good as others are. Maybe not want to be identified so readily as one who's a follower of Jesus. The folks at Philadelphia recognized that they needed to be identified with Him irregardless of what the consequence might be. Jesus commends them. He said what is right about this group is that no matter what the consequence might be and no matter what others might say, they're not concerned about that. They stay steadfast with the Word and they allow Jesus to be the vindicator through all this. Friends, you don't have to say, I don't believe in Jesus to deny Him. You and I don't have to verbalize the words to be a denier of Jesus. Simply by refusing to be identified with Him, simply by refusing to honor His Word, simply by allowing the world to have influence over us and refusing to be guided by the standard of God, all those have the same result of denial of Jesus as if I had said the words themselves. Sometimes we've convinced ourselves that so long as I don't make the statement, so long as I don't say, I don't believe in you more, Jesus, I don't believe in you anymore, that all is well. But we can deny Him by simply not standing up for Him. We can deny Him by simply not honoring what He teaches. We can deny Him by not living the moral purity that He offers unto us. There are 1,000 ways to deny Jesus. And He says, even when you're weakened, even when the pressures mount, even when those around us continually bombard us with thoughts and try to convince us to start being a little less like Jesus and a little more like the world, if I want the vindication that comes from the Savior, then I need to stay steadfast. We as a congregation need to stay steadfast. And then in verse 10, back in Revelation 3, He says, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Now, I'm not going to answer tonight a question I'm sure I'm going to get asked after services. When he speaks here to the idea of, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the trial, the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world. I know the idea is they're going to ask, well, what's he mean by that? What trial is he talking about? Does he have some kind of specific thing in mind, or does he have some kind of specific historical moment in mind, or is this more a general thought? And I'll share with you very quickly. I believe he's speaking about simply the judgment that he brings down. When God brings judgment, whether it's final judgment, if you want to talk about it that way, if you want to talk about just judgment against nations when they fail Him, if you want to talk specifically about the Roman Empire as they're failing God and seeking attacks upon Christians, irregardless of what kind of judgment you want to demonstrate or talk about in relationship to God, what He says to this group is, I will spare you the difficulties of that judgment. When I bring it down, when I bring judgment down, I'll help and strengthen you. You will not face the same kinds of difficulties that others face when I bring my judgment. I don't know that we can perfectly understand what moment in history or some specific thought that he may have in mind there. The idea that we should gain is that when you stay steadfast with Jesus, when you honor His Word, when you stay dedicated and do not deny Him, that He strengthens you when trials and challenges come. And when His judgment comes, you don't have to face that. You don't have to deal with the condemnation that comes from that judgment because you have been faithful. How do I avoid falling into the hands of a living God? How do I avoid the consequences of hellfire and brimstone as we studied in our Bible class a few weeks ago? How do I avoid the consequences of the judgment of a strong and mighty God? Well, I do that by being faithful, by being steadfast. And I'm comforted in knowing and appreciate the comfort of God because I know that He'll secure me and that I won't have to meet with the same fate that so many others have had to face because they've left the Savior. Verse 11 says, Behold, I am coming quickly. That's interesting, isn't it? When you try to extrapolate this scene and start talking about, is he talking about some particular moment in history? Be careful. Because whatever judgment that he's speaking of here, he just said, Behold, I come quickly. Not in hundreds and hundreds of years, not in 1,000 years, not in another millennium. He says, I come quickly. So be careful. Don't go running, so fast ahead that we miss what he said. And try to piece some kind of moment. I'm coming with this judgment, Jesus says, quickly. And so whatever it is in specific, what I know about it is that it's going to quickly happen. So stay steadfast. Don't become uncomfortable. Don't lose faith. Don't disregard your connection to me. Because I come quickly, hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. I'm coming in judgment. So hold fast to the crown, and Christ will hold fast to you. There's something in some ways very peculiar about losing something in the last moment. All Steeler fans know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't even know why I recorded that today. I have to sit through that last minute and 25 seconds. Right? You know what it's like. I'm simply illustrating, and there are enough Steeler fans in the room to help me get there. I'm simply illustrating to you that you know the feeling of losing something in the last moment. You've got it in your grasp. It is all right there to receive the benefits from, and in the last moment you relinquish that, and you no longer have access to it. Jesus says, I'm coming in judgment. I'm coming quickly. I want you to stay steadfast because I want you to have that crown still in your hands when I get there. These other churches of Asia appear to be letting loose very, very quickly on what Jesus had provided them. You've got a lukewarm church that we'll see, Lord willing, next Sunday night. You've got corrupting churches. You've got compromising churches. We have seen all various types and kinds of groups in our study thus far. Each of them with maybe particular issues and challenges that they need to consider because they are slowly loosening their grip upon the crown that Jesus has given them. I don't recall whether, I think I preached a sermon here some time ago. If you don't shake your head no if you don't want to listen to it again, because if you shake your head no, that means I didn't. But I believe we talked one time about salvation being past, present, or future. We talked about the importance of recognizing to not only think of salvation as something that we received years ago when we were baptized, and salvation is not only something that happens way out here in the distance when Jesus comes, but salvation has a very present tense about it. Not just we were saved, but I am saved. That I live in a present condition of being saved in Jesus Christ. Here's the point I want you to remember from that, if I happen to preach it sometime in the past, is that when we recognize that I am in the present state of being saved, I am saved, then my obligation is to hold on to that salvation. My obligation is to hold fast to it. Friends, when Jesus returns and final judgment happens, my salvation and the fate of my salvation will have already been sealed. It's not something that Jesus is going to then grant unto me at the end of this process. Salvation is something that I will already have had in my present tense. He talks, when we think about the crown of life and we think about having the crown, we think about what? We think about heaven, and we think about the reward, and we think about that robe, and we think about that whole majestic process. I want you to recognize something. He said they've already got the crown in their hands. They're already holding it. And so He commends them to hold fast. Salvation is in your hands right now. Salvation is presently in your hands, so don't let go of it. Challenges are going to come. Problems may come. Temptations may come. Satan's synagogue may rear its head and lure us and try to get us away from what Jesus has commended us to. I'm simply encouraging all of us to recognize that He said, hold on, because when I come in judgment, someday Jesus will return. When He come in judgment, then Jesus wants to see us holding on to that crown. How many of us might be trying to look for it at that time? How many of us might be trying to search and figure out, where did I put that? Where did I set my crown down at? Jesus says, I want you to hold it when I come, and that way I'll know and I'll identify and I'll vindicate those who are holding fast. Verse 5 of Hebrews 13. Let your conduct be without covetousness, to be content with such things as you have. For He Himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Jesus says, I'll never leave you. You hold fast to that crown. You hold fast to me. I will hold fast to you. He strengthens them and encourages them. Salvation is in your hands. Don't let go. And then verse 12, back in Romans chapter 3, or Revelation chapter 3. That familiar phrase, He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name. He says, overcome and know security. Overcome, and I'll identify you. Again, my friends, I'm asking you tonight, and don't. Hopefully you don't fault me, and I guess if you do, that's okay too. But I take a very simplistic approach. I try not to overcomplicate things. And sometimes we'll sit and we'll try to, well, what name's he talking? It's simple in many ways. What did he say? My name, my identifier. I'll mark you. I'll know who you are. You will be identified with me. And there won't be any need for this. I'll know exactly who you are. You'll be identifiable. I won't have to guess as to whether you're still holding your crown or not. I won't have to guess as to whether you were steadfast or not. I won't overcome, and I'll know who you are. Overcome, and I'll put my name on you. You'll be identified. The promised reward of that new Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven. See the picture? The identification of this is a person who belongs in that heavenly realm. Here's a person that's been marked with my name, identified. They belong to me. I'm going to give them access to that new Jerusalem. I'm going to give them access to that dwelling place of God. Overcome and know security. Overcome and know that I'll know exactly who you are. And then I'll make you a pillar in the temple of God. It's interesting. I read a little bit as we close tonight. I read a little bit about this place, Philadelphia. Apparently there are a lot of earthquakes in that particular region. This place had been destroyed and rebuilt on many different occasions because of those earthquakes. So I simply illustrate that to you to recognize that when he starts talking about structures and pillars and things that are pillars or support beams and those, they're making an instantaneous connection because they had recognized over their existence a building and rebuilding and a rebuilding and a destroyed and rebuilding process that they had known for a long, long time. And so when he starts using architectural terms, if you will, when he starts using building terms, they will be able to make a very quick connection to what he's speaking about. You'll become a pillar, a strength. You can become part of the support structure, if you will. I can use you to help and support others who may be weak and challenged, if you'll accept that role. The Church at Philadelphia is a good church. The Church at Philadelphia had a lot of good things going for it. Especially their steadfastness in all the challenges that they had faced. It's admirable to think that nothing wrong was ever listed. No consequence. Just here's what you've been doing well. Keep doing it. Hold on to that crown. Because when I come, I don't want you to get washed up in that judgment with others. I want to be able to identify and say, here are my people. They've got my name on them. They've been a pillar to my people. They've been part of the temple of God. You set them aside. They don't need judgment that comes down from God. They are my children. They're my followers. And what a blessing that would be for any of us to be able to have that opportunity. I would hope that the Lord, if He were to write to us, what a benefit it would be to think that He would only write positive things about who we are as His servants. You may be subject to the gospel tonight. Maybe it's time to come to Jesus and appreciate the salvation that He offers. Maybe you've let go of that salvation. You embraced it at one point, but you've let go of it. And it's time to come back to Him. Whatever we could do tonight to strengthen you, to help you in some way, to appreciate the benefits of salvation. Will you honor Him? Will you serve Him? Will you be found identified with the name of Jesus when He comes? And if we could help you do that, step out on His promises, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?